My name is Henrik Bodilsen. I'm Danish, born and bred in Copenhagen back in 1968 by my mum, who's a teacher, and dad, who's an engineer. Went to school there, and obviously that was the early 70s, at the time of quite progressive educational changes to how kids were being brought up and taught, and obviously very much in the midst of the sort of feminist movements, etc., which had a huge influence on my schooling and everything. Went through school and moved around a bit in Denmark, and then after graduating from the equivalent to A-levels, I met an English designer, and at the time I was looking into doing architecture and various things in Denmark and explored doing the courses over there, and there wasn't really much happening. Architecture has always been a huge thing in Denmark, but design courses in general has not really taken off, apart from, say, furniture and sort of more craft-based things. But graphic design was not really a big sort of thing compared to the UK. So I started talking to him and made a short trip to London and went around and had a look at all the courses over here. Then decided to do my degree here, and so I came over in the early 90s and completed my degree in visual communication design at Ravensbourne College. And then decided that London was a cool place to be, and enjoyed the scene and obviously the freedom of being in a big sort of cosmopolitan place compared to Denmark, which was hugely different, Then, or Copenhagen, for instance, you would still class that as a village compared to say London. So that obviously had its appeal, and started out after my degree working for a Swedish designer who needed somebody who could obviously understand the language for some magazines he was doing, and gradually from there looked around and started to sort of explore what would I like to do, and didn't quite find the jobs or the environments that I was sort of expecting or comparing to I knew was happening back home. Didn't feel that as a gay man that you perhaps were quite so accepted and tolerated in the design sort of industry. And though you might have had people that didn't mind, I think you would always still at that time find that the design industry was quite conservative and quite typically white male oriented in terms of who was boss and who was calling the shots, etc. And being Danish, I found it quite difficult to cope with the sort of shall we say, just general management skills that you were presented with, and coming from quite an orderly society where everything absolutely works to like clockwork, and it was quite a difference to go into sort of more chaotic kind of environments that you see in London design studios, etc. And so it wasn't for me, and I'd kind of set up as a freelance designer and pretty much done that ever since, and worked independently and enjoyed that, and it's meant that I've been able to get involved with sort of cultural projects and educational organisations more so than say work as a designer for more sort of commercially oriented project or clients. So started doing that and kind of left the suburbs of London and moved into Cavell Street in Whitechapel, where I lived with my partner for 3 or 4 years, and just was living up the buzz that was there at the time, around Brick Lane and the whole sort of regeneration of that area, Spitalfields and up through Shoreditch. It was very exciting and very sort of it was a challenge, certainly, because it's when you're coming from Denmark, you're coming from very orderly, very organised, sort of very civilised sort of setup where nothing much surprises you on a daily basis. But walking down Cavell Street as often the only white person, in a hugely, or predominantly Bangladeshi. Cavell Street had I think 1 or 2 mosques, Muslim, areas. I think it was just what gave that area its colour and its buzz, and we weren't living in a particularly sort of luxurious place or whatever, but where we were, it was exhilarating because it was a very strong sort of cultural vibe in the block that we lived in, and that led to getting involved with people who lived in the area, and in a way that you just wouldn't have if I'd stayed out in say the suburbs. And I think that was a great challenge, but though it was a challenge, I've always loved that about where I go to any city, that you find the colourful places, because that's what appeals to me. That's where where I travel. I'm not saying I'm trying to get away from perhaps what I grew up in, but there is you're seeking an alternative way of life. I've always, as a gay man, consider myself the alternative, to the typical mainstream norm, and I think that comes through in what I choose to do and what I get involved with, and I think that for me is what life is about. It makes it interesting, it makes it worth getting up every day. Whereas if I was in a 9-to-5 job, I just couldn't do it. It would be utterly tedious, I think. So, but it's been a challenge because I've been in London now 20 years, and I think London also obviously is a tough place if you don't have money, if you don't have the same sense of security that, say, I might have had if I'd stayed in Denmark. But then I think the restrictions of having that security would also have brought about significant kind of personal sort of strains, in the sense that once you lock yourself into the norm, as a designer, I think you take away what inspires you, takes away the creativity, and I think that's what's unique about London, and I think that's any designer, I think, can recollect that from their own sort of experiences, that I think you need the challenges in order to stay creative, because without it, I think you feel that there's no spark, there's nothing to inspire you, there's nothing to move you on, to want to do things better and to help and promote things that could create change for others. And I always compare, of course, Denmark with London, in the sense that, what if I'd stayed there, and I just have to remind myself that I think that I could have stayed in Denmark, and maybe I could have had a good life and pretty straightforward life, but I also think I would have missed out on huge opportunities from sort of just personal gain of being involved with cultural projects, which I've had an opportunity to do here. I ran my design studio for about 10 years together with my partner Andrew, and we set up a small design studio in Old Petrol Station in East London, and not that the building itself or anything resembled anything like a petrol station, but it was, and we were in the old sort of shop unit and sort of converted that into a sort of studio space, and named the company Unleaded, which of course had the connotations of the petrol station, but it was also to do with computers taking over and no longer using lead type for typography, etc. There were sort of double meanings and what have you. And we worked with various companies like the Haber Gallery and Milton Keynes Gallery and other educational organisations like the Royal Society of Art, and doing lots of educational cultural projects and helping with the communications for their print and design and stuff. And later on, I became involved with an actors agency based in London, and have been doing so ever since. And again, it's often projects that are people oriented that I'm involved with, because I think that's where that's where the challenges lies. It's where you learn something new, both personally and creatively and professionally. And I think that's a challenge that you get from being in London, which I think compared to a smaller culture like Denmark, it's safer and it's more organised and it's more sort of evened out by its sort of normality, if you like, whereas London has huge differences. You turn a corner and you're in X luxurious street, and then you go to the next one and you've got deprived council estate, which I think most foreigners find a challenge, because it's such a shock to the system when you walk through London to see those contrasts. But I think that's also what makes it unique. But that said, it is a challenge. It's a huge challenge, and I think it takes people by surprise when you come here for the first time. And so I've been working on and off on various projects, and eventually gave up my design studio and now work for various companies in sort of marketing capacity, where I'm helping out with promoting the services of the various companies and what they need in terms of promotion. And I think it's what I enjoy the most, because I think the freedom of being freelance and having that ability to stretch myself and get involved with things which I probably couldn't do if I was in a 9-to-5 job, is what carries me through, and what makes me accept also the limitation that comes with that. That it, on one hand, is a limitation perhaps in financially, because you're not having the stability of a full-time job. It's what gives you the flexibility to allow yourself to be involved with particular cultural projects, which often are hugely demanding and draining in every possible way. But you just simply couldn't do it if you were working 9-to-5 because of a stricter schedule. And I think that, again, one of the things that's unique about London, and I think was pretty much the reason why I decided to stay in London after my degree. And I think where I ended up after doing my degree in Whitechapel was I think the spark or the kick that basically set off my next sort of 2 decades, if you like, being in London. So but yeah.